before there were clinics, before there were therapists, before anyone had a name for the unconscious mind. Human beings were already lying down in the dark, waiting for a dream to save them. The oldest dream manual in the world is written on papyrus, discovered near the ancient city of Thebes in Upper Egypt. It dates back to around 1350 years before the Common Era, though some of the knowledge it carries is even older, reaching back nearly 1,000 years before that. The text describes a ritual for summoning a god named Bes, a small dwarf deity with a lion's mane and a tongue forever sticking out, the protector of mothers, of music, of sleep, and of dreams. The instructions read like this: draw an image of Bes on your left hand. Wrap your hand in black cloth that has been consecrated to the goddess Isis. Lie down to sleep without speaking a single word, not even to answer a question. Wind the rest of the cloth around your neck, and then wait. The god was supposed to arrive before the night was over, appearing directly inside your dream. The papyrus is known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and it contains over 100 dream interpretations, each one beginning with the phrase, if a man sees himself in a dream doing this, then this will happen. The dreams were classified as either good or bad. The good ones were written in black ink, the bad ones in red, the color of danger. To dream of a cat meant a good harvest. To dream of a snake meant abundance. To dream of your own death meant a long life. But to dream of a dead man carrying you away, that was a warning written in red, a message from the underworld that could not be ignored. This was not a superstition. It was a system. Across Egypt, temples were built specifically for this purpose, and they were called sleep temples or dream temples. They functioned as hospitals thousands of years before modern medicine existed. Patients would travel sometimes for weeks to reach them, arriving sick, injured, or haunted by something they could not name. They would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, burning incense, chanting hymns, all designed to prepare the mind for what was about to come. The incense alone was a kind of medicine, a blend of honey, wine, cinnamon, and myrrh called kaifi, a scent so rich and calming that it could slow the breath and quiet the mind before a single word was spoken. Then they would be led into a dark, windowless chamber and left alone to sleep. The treatment was the dream itself. The priest would enter the next morning not with a scalpel, but with an interpretation. And sometimes, the records claim, people simply walked out healed. The Egyptians believed that dreams were messages carried by the god Thoth, the scribe of the gods, the one who recorded everything. Thoth was the god of writing, of wisdom, of magic. He had the head of an ibis, a long curved beak, and he held a reed pen and a palette of ink. Every night, as a person slept, Thoth was watching, taking notes, weaving the events of the day into symbols that the dreamer could understand. If you wanted to understand a dream, you went to a priest of Thoth, a man trained in reading the sacred signs. Dream interpretation in Egypt was not fortune-telling. It was a literate craft, a skill passed down through generations of scribes and priests, and it was taken as seriously as medicine or law. The most famous of these Egyptian dream temples was associated with a man named Imhotep. He lived around 2,700 years before the Common Era. He was the chief architect of the pharaoh Djoser, the man who designed the very first pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. But Imhotep was more than an architect. He was also a physician, a priest, an astronomer, and a writer. Centuries after his death, he was deified, and temples were built in his honor where the sick would come to sleep and dream of his healing hands. The Greeks would later identify him with their own god of medicine, Asclepius. The Egyptians called him the Prince of Peace, and for nearly 3,000 years, people believed that if you slept in his temple, he might appear to you in a vision and touch you back to health. The Egyptians also protected sleep with magic. Small amulets carved from bone or stone were placed around the neck of the dreamer before they entered the temple. These amulets bore images of Bes, of Thoth, of the goddess Serket, who guarded against poison and evil. The sleeper would wear these symbols through the night, trusting that the gods carved into stone would watch over them while their conscious mind was away. The amulet was a kind of anchor, a physical object that connected the sleeping body to the divine realm, ensuring that whatever the dreamer encountered in the night, they would return safely by morning. But the Egyptians were not the first. About 500 miles to the east, in the floodplains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, older civilizations had already been doing this for centuries. The ancient Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, believed that dreams were messages from the gods, written in a language that required expert translation. They invented the world's first professional dream interpreters, people called the Shelu, which means the askers. These were trained specialists who studied catalogs of dream symbols the way a doctor today studies anatomy. If a man flew in his dream, his difficulties would be resolved. If he ate raw meat, he would become rich. If he fell from a height, he would lose status. If his teeth fell out, something his family was hiding would soon come to light. If he drank the water of a river, he would live a long life. If he drank wine, he would find happiness. If he drank blood, his enemies would be defeated. Thousands of these interpretations were pressed into clay tablets and stored in the great library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Over 30,000 tablets in total, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace in 612 before the Common Era, and preserved forever the things that haunted the ancient mind. The Assyrian Dream Book, discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library, is the oldest dream dictionary in existence. It was organized like a manual. Each entry began with a condition. If a man sees this in his dream, followed by the outcome. The interpretations were written in 2 columns, one for good omens and one for bad, so that the interpreter could quickly find the meaning of any symbol. The tablet also contained a section of rituals for neutralizing bad dreams, instructions for making offerings, reciting prayers, and performing purifications that would cancel the negative power of a nightmare before it could affect the dreamer's waking life. It was a complete system of dream management, and it was already ancient when the Greeks were still painting their first temples. Alongside the Shalu, the askers, there were also the Baru, the diviners. While the Shalu focused specifically on dreams, the Baru studied the entire fabric of fate, the stars, the flight of birds, the pattern of smoke, the liver of a sacrificed animal. They were trained in a complex science of signs that covered every aspect of life. Dreams were just one thread in a vast web of omens that the gods wove around human beings every day. The Baru could look at a dream and connect it to the position of the planets, the phase of the moon, the season of the year, building a complete picture of what the gods were trying to say. The Mesopotamians recognized 3 distinct kinds of dreams. The first was the message dream, where a god or a dead relative appeared and spoke directly, leaving no room for interpretation, just instruction. The second was the symbolic dream, filled with images that required a trained interpreter to decode. The third was the mantic dream, a prophetic vision that predicted events still to come. This 3-part system would influence dream classification for the next 3,000 years, all the way down to Freud and Jung. One of the tablets from Nineveh contains the world's first recorded dream, attributed to a Sumerian king named Gudea, who ruled the city-state of Lagash around 2100 years before the Common Era. Gudea dreamed that a giant man appeared before him, so tall that his head touched the sky. The figure did not speak, but the meaning was clear. Beside the giant stood a woman who held a golden stylus and a clay tablet, and she was reading the stars. When Gudea woke, he understood that the gods were telling him to build a temple. He did not trust his own interpretation, so he sought out a dream interpreter who confirmed the vision. Gudea built the temple, and the inscription describing this dream is still in existence, carved into a statue of diorite that now sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It is the first time in human history that a person wrote down what they dreamed and tried to understand what it meant. The Mesopotamians also believed that dreams rose from a specific place. Deep beneath the earth, there was a vast ocean of fresh water called the Abzu. This was the domain of the god Enki, the lord of wisdom, the keeper of the me, the sacred laws that governed the universe. Enki lived in the Abzu, and from that hidden depth, dreams bubbled up like springs, rising through the earth to reach the sleeping mind. To dream was to draw water from the well of divine wisdom. The temples of Enki were built directly over springs and wells, so that the dreamer would be as close as possible to the source. The Mesopotamians also invented dream incubation, the deliberate act of sleeping in a sacred place in order to receive a vision. Temples contained special chambers where seekers would sleep after fasting, prayer, and ritual preparation. They would call out to Mamu, the goddess of dreams, or to Zakik, the spirit of dreams, asking for a vision that was clear and undisguised. There was a prayer that went like this: O Mamu, goddess of dreams, I bring you my offering. Send me tonight a dream of truth, clear and undisguised, that I may know my fate. And when the dream arrived, if it was frightening, there were rituals to undo it. The most powerful of these was called the Namberbai, a word that means undoing. The dreamer would describe the nightmare to a small clay figurine, which would then be burned in a fire, destroying the bad dream along with it. There was also the Sherpu ritual, a purification by fire that literally burned away the influence of the nightmare. Therapy through flame, 4,000 years before anyone coined the term cognitive reprocessing. But the most famous dream temples in the ancient world belonged to the Greeks. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the cult of Asclepius, the god of medicine, had spread across the entire Mediterranean world. At Epidaurus, at Kos, at Pergamon, enormous healing sanctuaries were built, called the Asclepia. They were not simply temples. They were fully integrated medical centers, complete with gymnasiums, baths, libraries, theaters, and sleeping halls. The treatment was called incubatio, from the Latin word incubare, meaning to lie down on something, the same root that gives us the word incubation, as if the patient were an egg waiting to hatch into a new body. The ritual followed a precise pattern. First came purification, a cleansing diet that lasted several days, along with baths and sacrifices to the god. Then the patient was led into a long hall called the abaton, a dormitory open to the night air, where they would lie down on a bed of animal skins and wait. The temple was filled with snakes, the sacred animal of Asclepius, gliding freely across the stone floors in the dark. They were not feared. They were revered as living embodiments of the god himself. The patient would fall asleep, and then, if the god chose to appear, he would visit them in their dream. Sometimes he came as a physician with a kind face and a prescription. Sometimes he came as a light. Sometimes he came as a hand reaching into the body to pull out the sickness itself. The family of Asclepius reflected the many forms that healing could take. His daughter Panacea was the goddess of universal remedy. His daughter Hygeia was the goddess of health and cleanliness, whose name gives us the word hygiene. His daughter Iaso was the goddess of recuperation. His daughter Asiso was the goddess of the healing process itself. His daughter Eagle was the goddess of radiant good health. Together, they represented the complete spectrum of medicine, from prevention to recovery to cure. At Epidaurus, 3 large marble slabs dating back to 350 years before the Common Era preserve the names and the stories of about 70 patients who were healed in this way. One inscription tells of a man named Alcetus of Haliais, who was completely blind. He lay down in the temple and dreamed that the god approached him and opened his eyes with his fingers. When he woke up, he could see the trees in the sanctuary. Another tells of a woman named Arata of Laestimen, who suffered from swelling throughout her body. She dreamed that the god cut open her abdomen, drained the fluid, and stitched her back up. When she woke, she was well. Another inscription describes a man named Cleinatas of Thebes, who was covered head to toe with lice. He dreamed that the gods stripped him, stood him up naked, and swept the lice from his body with a broom. When morning came, he walked out clean. The surgical descriptions are so precise, mentioning the opening of abscesses and the removal of foreign objects, that some historians believe the priests of Asclepius may have actually performed operations under cover of darkness, while the patient was in a deep, drug-induced sleep, using opium or other soporific herbs to create something that looks uncannily like modern anesthesia. Not everyone received a surgical dream. Many were simply told what to do. One patient was instructed to go to the gymnasium every day. Another was told to drink a specific tea made from herbs. Another was told to stop worrying. The advice was practical, personalized, and often surprisingly modern. The priests who ran these temples had accumulated generations of medical knowledge, and the dream was often just the vehicle through which the prescription was delivered. The patient believed the god had spoken to them, and that belief itself was part of the cure. Some Greek healers took incubation even further. They were called the iatromantes, the healer prophets, and they claimed that incubation could unlock a fourth state of consciousness, beyond waking, beyond dreaming, beyond ordinary sleep. They called this state enkomesis, a deep trance in which the healer himself could travel to the realm of the gods and bring back knowledge for the sick. This tradition stretched back to the shamans of Central Asia, and it suggests that some ancient Greeks understood sleep not as a single state, but as a spectrum of possible experiences, each with its own healing power. The sanctuary at Epidaurus also contained a theater, widely considered the most acoustically perfect structure ever built. It seated nearly 14,000 people, and a coin dropped at center stage could be heard in the very highest row. Patients would sit in that theater and watch tragedies and comedies, stories of suffering and redemption. And the Greeks believed that this emotional purging, which they called catharsis, was an essential part of the healing process. The drama was a kind of dreaming while awake, a way of processing fear and grief through story, so that when the patient finally lay down in the abaton, the mind was already open and ready. The Greeks took dreams seriously enough that the father of medicine himself, Hippocrates, wrote about them. He studied at the Asclepian on the island of Kos, and he believed that during sleep, the soul could perceive the body's true condition, sensing illness before any symptom appeared in waking life. A dream, he said, was a signal from within, a message from the body to the mind. A few generations later, Aristotle wrote 3 entire essays on sleep and dreams, trying to understand what happens when the conscious mind steps aside and something older takes its place. He called dreams the work of the residual senses, images that rise from the day and rearrange themselves in the dark. But even he admitted that some dreams seemed to carry knowledge that the dreamer did not possess while awake. Several centuries later, the great physician Galen treated patients at the Asclepian of Pergamon before becoming the personal doctor to the the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and he too believed that dreams could reveal the inner state of the body. The practice of incubation did not end with the Greeks. It was adopted by the Romans, who built their own Asclepia across the empire. One of the most remarkable was discovered in 1928 at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire, England, a Roman sleep temple dedicated to the god Nodens, a local deity associated with healing and dreams. The excavation was led by the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, and his assistant was a young professor of Anglo-Saxon named J.R.R. Tolkien. Together, they unearthed the remains of a temple where Britons, nearly 2,000 years ago, came to sleep and dream of healing. When Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, incubation did not disappear. It was absorbed. The Byzantine Empire produced a tradition of sleeping in the churches of saint healers, Saints Cosmas and Damian, Saint Artemius, Saint Thecla. The sick would lie down in the church, just as their ancestors had lain down in the temples of Asclepius, and wait for the saint to appear in a dream. The practice continued for over 1,000 years. In some remote Greek monasteries, it is still happening today. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, as psychology emerged as a science, the ancient traditions found a new language. Sigmund Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. Carl Jung called them the voice of the self, speaking in symbols that mirrored the myths of every culture on earth. Neither of them knew about the Shailu of Mesopotamia or the sleep temples of Egypt, and yet they arrived at the same conclusion that the ancients had reached thousands of years before. Dreams mean something. They are trying to tell you something that you cannot hear while you are awake. What all of these cultures understood, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, was the same essential thing. Sleep is not nothing. It is not the absence of waking. It is a state of profound receptivity, a doorway that opens when the guard leaves his post. The Egyptians knew this. The Mesopotamians knew this. The Greeks built their entire medical system around it. They believed that in sleep, the boundary between the human and the divine became thin, that the body could repair itself in ways the waking mind could not direct, that the dream was not a random byproduct of the brain, but a message, sometimes from a god, sometimes from the body itself, sometimes from a part of you that you have never learned to hear. The sleep temples are gone now. The chambers are empty. The snakes have left, but the practice itself never really disappeared. It just changed its name. It became hypnosis. It became therapy. It became dream analysis. It became the quiet moment before sleep when you finally let go of the day. Every time you close your eyes and drift into that space between waking and dreaming, you are doing exactly what they did. You are lying down in the dark, waiting for something to arrive. And whether you call it a god, or an insight, or a healing, or just a dream, the door is still there. It has always been there. It is the oldest door we have,